April 18, 1942. Tokyo was certain it was untouchable. 16 American bombers had no fighter escort, no safe return route, not enough runway, not enough fuel, not even a real chance of survival. They were never supposed to take off from an aircraft carrier. And yet, in less than 30 seconds per aircraft, history changed. When those engines roared to life on the deck of the USS Hornet, it wasn't just a mission, it was a message. Japan had struck Pearl Harbor. Now America had reached the heart of the empire. And for the first time since the war began, Tokyo burned. On December 7, 1941, the Pacific caught fire. Over the harbor at Pearl Harbor, smoke rose in black pillars as battleships burned and sailors fought through oil-slicked water. The attack had been swift, calculated, and devastating. In a single morning, the illusion of American security dissolved beneath Japanese bombs. Across the Pacific, in the capital of the Japanese Empire, life continued beneath the orderly skyline of Tokyo. Newspapers celebrated victory. Military leaders spoke confidently of a defensive perimeter stretching across Asia and the Pacific. The homeland, they believed, was beyond the reach of American retaliation. Distance was their shield. But distance, as history would prove, was no longer protection. In Washington, the mood was grim and urgent. The United States had entered a global war unprepared, wounded, and humiliated. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. The Philippines were collapsing. American forces were retreating across Southeast Asia. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood something fundamental. America needed a victory, not merely strategic but psychological. The nation required proof that it could strike back. The question was simple. How do you hit an enemy whose homeland lies thousands of miles across open ocean? Japan's main islands were far beyond the range of land-based bombers. Aircraft carriers could approach, but launching medium bombers from a carrier deck was considered impossible. Naval aviation doctrine was clear. Carriers launched light, specialized naval aircraft, not large army bombers designed for long runways. Yet desperation breeds innovation. And innovation in wartime can look like madness. The idea began to take shape in early 1942. Load Army Air Force's medium bombers onto a Navy aircraft carrier, sail within range of Japan, launch them toward Tokyo, and then have them continue west to friendly airfields in China. It was audacious. It was reckless. It was unprecedented. There would be no returning to the carrier. No margin for navigational error. No rescue guarantee. The crews would be flying into the heart of enemy territory with minimal fighter cover and only enough fuel, if calculations were perfect, to reach China. One man was chosen to command the mission, Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle. Jimmy Doolittle was not merely a pilot. He was an aviation pioneer, engineer, test pilot, racing champion, and one of the most technically accomplished flyers in the world. If anyone could turn impossibility into execution, it was him. But even Doolittle understood the reality. This was likely a one-way mission. Training began in secret at Eglin Field, Florida. The aircraft selected was the North American B-25 Mitchell, a twin-engine medium bomber sturdy enough to carry bombs, yet compact enough, perhaps, to attempt a carrier launch. The modifications were meticulous. Extra fuel tanks were installed to extend range. Defensive armament was adjusted. Weight was shaved wherever possible. Even a simple broomstick painted black was mounted in the tail to resemble a defensive gun, deterring potential fighter attacks. Every pound mattered. Every foot of runway mattered more. Carrier decks were short, dangerously short for a bomber designed to use over 1,000 feet of concrete. Pilots practiced short-field takeoffs relentlessly, learning to coax lift from aircraft that seemed reluctant to fly. They would have approximately 467 feet of deck. Not 1 foot more. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the carrier USS Hornet, CV-8, prepared for a mission unlike any in naval history. 16 B-25 bombers were craned aboard, lashed to the flight deck. Sailors stared at them in disbelief. The sight alone was extraordinary. Army bombers perched awkwardly atop a Navy vessel. The task force would be protected by another carrier, the USS Enterprise, CV-6, along with cruisers and destroyers. Their destination was the Western Pacific, approaching the Japanese homeland under radio silence. The plan depended on surprise. If detected too early, the bombers would be forced to launch from farther out, beyond safe fuel range. Fuel calculations were already razor-thin. On April 2, 1942, the Hornet departed San Francisco under a veil of secrecy. Even many crew members did not know the target. The B-25 crews understood the risks, but few grasped the strategic weight resting on their shoulders. They were not being sent to destroy Tokyo. They were being sent to prove it could be reached. As the task force cut through the cold Pacific waters, winds lashed the deck. Salt spray coated the bombers. Mechanics worked constantly to ensure engines remained pristine. Every mechanical failure could doom a crew hundreds of miles from safety. Time compressed. Tension built. And Japan remained unaware. Before dawn on April 18, 1942, the task force was still hundreds of miles farther from Japan than planned. Then came the sighting, a Japanese picket boat, part of a defensive early warning network. It had spotted them. The element of surprise was evaporating. Though the picket boat was sunk, a radio transmission may already have been sent. The decision had to be immediate. Launch now. Launch early. Launch from over 650 miles away. Doolittle did not hesitate. The mission would proceed. Even if it meant most crews would likely run out of fuel before reaching China. Wind roared across the deck of the Hornet as sailors cleared the flight path. The carrier turned into the wind to maximize lift. Waves crashed against the hull, pitching the deck violently. The first aircraft rolled forward. Doolittle's engines thundered at full throttle, straining against the brakes. The aircraft shuddered, heavy with fuel and bombs. Ahead lay nothing but gray ocean. 467 feet. That was the distance between history and disaster. Doolittle released the brakes. The bomber surged forward, tires rattling across the wooden deck. Sailors watched in silence as the aircraft reached the edge, nose dipping slightly as it left the deck. For a split second it seemed to hang in the air. Then the wings caught lift. The bomber rose above the Pacific. One by one, 16 B-25s followed. Each had roughly 30 seconds to achieve flight, or plunge into the sea. Each succeeded. The impossible had been done. Hours later, Japanese civilians in Tokyo looked up at an unfamiliar sound. Not the high whine of Japanese fighters. Not the expected pattern of drills. These were twin-engine bombers. American bombers. They approached at low altitude, weaving between buildings, releasing bombs over military targets, industrial facilities and infrastructure. Anti-aircraft guns erupted in confusion. Fighters scrambled too late. The raid lasted minutes. The psychological shock would last years. Japan's capital, thought invulnerable, had been struck. The homeland was no longer sacred ground. Militarily, the physical damage was limited. The bombs ignited fires and destroyed selected targets, but they did not cripple Japan's war machine. That was never the primary objective. The objective was morale. And on that front, the mission succeeded beyond expectation. News of the strike electrified the United States. Headlines proclaimed retaliation. Radio broadcasts carried Roosevelt's subtle humor when asked where the bombers had come from. He simply replied, Shangri-La. But beneath the celebration lay grim reality. Most of the crews would not reach safe airfields. Fuel gauges ticked toward empty as the bombers flew west toward China through darkness and worsening weather. One aircraft diverted to the Soviet Union. The rest pressed onward, engines sputtering. As predicted, nearly all ran out of fuel before reaching designated landing strips. Crews bailed out into the night or crash-landed in remote Chinese territory. Several were captured. Some would face execution. Others would endure brutal imprisonment. The cost of those 30 seconds on the carrier deck had only begun to unfold. Yet strategically the consequences rippled outward. The Japanese High Command, stunned that American bombers had reached Tokyo, reassessed its defensive perimeter. The perceived vulnerability of the homeland accelerated plans to eliminate U.S. carrier forces entirely. That urgency would contribute directly to Japan's decision to attack Midway Island 2 months later. And at the Battle of Midway, the tide of the Pacific War would turn. Thus, in ways invisible to those who launched from the Hornet's deck, the Doolittle Raid reshaped the trajectory of World War II. Not through destruction, but through demonstration, through audacity, through proof. History often measures wars in divisions, tonnage, and territory. But sometimes, history pivots on seconds. On a bomber's wheels leaving a wooden deck. On a president's demand for action. On a calculated gamble taken by men who understood they might never return. The Doolittle Raid was not about leveling a city. It was about reclaiming initiative. It was about sending a message across an ocean. And it began with 30 seconds of engine roar over cold Pacific waves. 30 seconds that told Tokyo and the world that America could strike back. Dawn, April 18, 1942. The Pacific was gray and unforgiving. On the pitching deck of the USS Hornet, CV-8, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers sat nose to tail, engines silent but primed. Sea spray coated their fuselages. Sailors moved with deliberate precision. There was no cheering, no speeches, only calculation. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle stood beside the first aircraft, studying the wind over the bow. The task force had been detected hours earlier by a Japanese picket vessel. Though it was sunk, radio signals may have escaped. They were too far from Japan. More than 650 miles out. Every extra mile reduced the odds of reaching China. But turning back would mean failure. Doolittle gave the signal. Launch. The 30 seconds. The Hornet turned into the wind to maximize lift. Deck crews removed chocks. Engines roared alive, propellers biting the salt-heavy air. Doolittle's B-25 trembled at full throttle. The bomber's weight was extreme, bombs, ammunition, and every available space filled with extra fuel tanks. There was no room for error. If the aircraft dipped too low after leaving the deck, it would be swallowed by the sea. He released the brakes. The bomber lurched forward. Wheels bounced across the wooden planks. Sailors crouched instinctively as the aircraft accelerated. The deck seemed impossibly short. Halfway. 3/4. The bow rose and fell with the swell. Then the edge. For a breathless instant, the B-25 dropped toward the ocean, wings struggling for lift. Doolittle pulled gently, refusing to overcorrect. Air caught beneath the wings. The bomber climbed. A cheer erupted across the Hornet. 1 down. 15 to go. One by one, each crew repeated the ordeal. Some aircraft dipped frighteningly close to the waves before clawing skyward. Others lifted more cleanly, riding favorable gusts. Every takeoff lasted less than half a minute. Every takeoff rewrote aviation doctrine. Within an hour, the flight deck was empty. The Hornet's role was complete. Now the bombers were alone, crossing the Empire's shield. The formation did not remain tight for long. Fuel conservation required staggered altitudes and headings. Crews navigated by dead reckoning across a featureless expanse of ocean. Below them lay Japanese-controlled waters. Ahead, home islands thought immune from attack. By late morning, the coastline of Honshu appeared through haze. Fishing boats dotted the water. Civilians worked unaware that American bombers approached. Doolittle descended to low altitude to avoid radar detection. Buildings of Tokyo rose in the distance. Factories, docks, military installations. No fighter opposition yet. No organized anti-aircraft response. Surprise held. The bombing runs. Doolittle lined up his first target, an industrial complex supplying military production. Bomb bay doors opened. The aircraft steadied. Released. Bombs fell cleanly. Black smoke erupted seconds later. Other B-25s streaked across the city in separate attack lanes. Rail yards, oil storage tanks, military barracks, aircraft factories. The crews maintained low altitude to maximize accuracy and confusion. Japanese anti-aircraft guns finally responded, shells bursting erratically. Fighter aircraft scrambled, but interception was chaotic. Few defenders expected medium bombers in daylight over Tokyo. The raid lasted minutes. Not hours. Minutes. But psychologically it was seismic. Civilians looked skyward in disbelief. Sirens wailed too late. The Empire's capital had been pierced. The same scene unfolded over Yokohama, Kobe, Nagoya, secondary targets struck by other crews. Damage assessments later showed moderate destruction. Warehouses ignited, infrastructure disrupted, limited military impact. Strategically minor. Psychologically monumental. The long flight west. Bombs gone, fuel remained the enemy. Headwinds strengthened as crews turned toward China. Calculations already strained by the early launch now became grim mathematics. Some crews jettisoned additional weight. Others reduced engine power, sacrificing speed. Cloud cover thickened. Night approached. Fuel gauges slipped lower. Radio silence remained mandatory. The ocean disappeared beneath darkness. China lay hundreds of miles ahead, mountainous, unlit, and under partial Japanese occupation. They would not reach the designated airfields. Doolittle knew it. He ordered crews to prepare to bail out if necessary. Into the night. One by one, engines began to sputter. Crew members exchanged final glances. Parachutes were secured. Maps folded into jackets. At varying points along China's eastern provinces, 15 of the 16 aircraft either crash-landed or crews bailed out into blackness. Men descended blindly into forests, fields, rivers. Some landed hard, injured upon impact. One aircraft diverted north and landed in the Soviet Union, where the crew was interned due to Soviet neutrality agreements. But in China, the fate of most crews depended not on military strategy, but on civilians. Rescue and reprisal. Chinese villagers, risking execution, sheltered the American airmen. They provided food, guided them through Japanese patrol zones, and transported them toward nationalist-controlled territory. The rescue network was improvised yet courageous. But the consequences were brutal. Japanese forces launched a retaliatory campaign in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, seeking the raiders and punishing those who aided them. Villages were burned. Civilians executed. Biological and chemical warfare units conducted atrocities in reprisal. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians suffered during the subsequent operations. The raid's cost extended far beyond the 16 aircraft captured. 8 airmen were captured by Japanese forces. They were interrogated, beaten, and subjected to trial by a military tribunal. 3 were executed by firing squad. 1 died later in captivity from malnutrition and disease. The remaining 4 endured harsh imprisonment until war's end. Back in the United States, their fate remained uncertain for years. Doolittle himself feared the worst outcome, not capture, not death, but mission failure. Upon reaching friendly territory in China, he believed the limited physical damage might result in court-martial. Instead, he would receive the Medal of Honor. But that recognition could not erase the losses. Shock in Tokyo. Within the Japanese high command, the reaction was profound. The belief that the home islands were beyond reach had shaped strategic planning. Defensive perimeters in the Pacific were intended to keep American carriers far from Japan. Now it was clear, U.S. naval forces had penetrated those defenses. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto concluded that American carrier strength had to be destroyed decisively. The Imperial Navy accelerated plans to lure U.S. carriers into a decisive engagement near Midway Atoll. 2 months later, that plan would culminate in the Battle of Midway, where 4 Japanese carriers would be sunk. The Doolittle Raid did not win the Pacific War. But it forced Japan into strategic overreach. It shifted momentum. It compelled reaction. Shock in America. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt was asked where the bombers had come from, he smiled and replied, "Shangri-La." The public laughed. Morale soared. Newspapers printed bold headlines announcing the strike on Tokyo. The psychological wound of Pearl Harbor felt partially avenged. Recruitment increased. War bond drives intensified. For the first time since December 1941, Americans saw evidence that the tide could turn. The raid proved that initiative had returned. Doolittle's reckoning. Doolittle eventually learned the broader consequences, both strategic and humanitarian. He understood that Japanese reprisals in China were catastrophic. He also knew the raid had forced Japan's hand. History would validate the gamble. Yet Doolittle carried quiet gravity about the mission. He often emphasized that the true heroes included the Chinese civilians who paid the highest price. The raid was daring, but it was not bloodless. The strategic equation. From a purely military calculus. Physical damage to Japan, limited. Aircraft lost, 16. American casualties, significant, including executions and imprisonment. Chinese civilian casualties, immense. From a strategic perspective. Japanese homeland vulnerability exposed. Defensive doctrine disrupted. Carrier engagement accelerated. American morale restored. In modern military analysis, the raid represents a classic example of psychological warfare intersecting with operational risk. It demonstrated that symbolic action can generate disproportionate strategic effect. The mission had begun with 30 seconds of roaring engines. It ended with geopolitical reverberations across the Pacific. The men who launched from the Hornet could not see Midway in their future. They could not predict how a brief bombing run would alter naval strategy. They only knew that they had crossed an ocean and struck an empire. In doing so, they transformed the narrative of the war. The United States was no longer on the defensive. It was reaching forward. Wars are often remembered for the battles that redraw maps. But sometimes, history pivots on something smaller, on a decision made in minutes, on engines roaring for half a minute, on a gamble taken when retreat would have been safer. The Doolittle Raid did not flatten Tokyo. It did not cripple Japan's industrial capacity. It did not end the war. What it did was far more subtle and far more powerful. It changed belief. The strategic echo. When the 16 B-25s lifted off the deck of the USS Hornet CV-8, they carried more than bombs. They carried a strategic message. The Pacific was no longer a moat protecting the Japanese homeland. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan's expansion seemed unstoppable. Singapore had fallen. The Philippines were collapsing. Allied forces retreated across Southeast Asia. The Imperial Navy appeared dominant. But the raid shattered the illusion of invulnerability. Japanese leadership faced an uncomfortable truth. If American bombers could reach Tokyo once, they could do so again, perhaps in greater numbers. That fear accelerated strategic decisions already under debate. The push to eliminate American carrier forces became urgent rather than cautious. This urgency shaped the Japanese plan to draw U.S. forces into battle at Midway. 2 months later, in June 1942, at the Battle of Midway, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were lost in a single catastrophic engagement. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted permanently. The Doolittle Raid did not win Midway, but it helped force it, and Midway changed the war. The human cost. Victory narratives often obscure sacrifice. Of the 80 men who launched toward Japan, all lost their aircraft. Several were wounded in crash landings. 8 were captured. 3 were executed after a trial designed to send a warning. 1 died of malnutrition in captivity. Others endured brutal imprisonment for years. And then there was China. Chinese civilians who aided the American airmen did so knowing the risk. Japanese reprisals were systematic and ruthless. Entire villages were destroyed. Tens of thousands, some historians estimate far more, suffered as punishment for helping the raiders. For decades, this dimension of the raid received less attention than the daring launch. But no honest assessment of history can separate audacity from consequence. The raid was heroic. It was also costly. Doolittle's burden. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle believed, upon reaching safety in China, that he would be court-martialed. His reasoning was simple. All 16 aircraft were lost. Material damage to Japan appeared limited. By conventional metrics, the mission had failed. Instead, he was awarded the Medal of Honor and promoted. Yet those who knew Doolittle understood that recognition never fully displaced reflection. He remained acutely aware of the Chinese losses and the airmen who did not return. Leadership in war carries paradox. The same decision that lifts morale can unleash suffering beyond prediction. Doolittle accepted both realities. America's shift. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt joked that the bombers had launched from Shangri-La, it masked operational secrecy with humor. But beneath the wit was relief. America needed proof of resilience. The raid delivered it. War bond sales surged. Recruitment climbed. Public confidence stabilized. The psychological wound of Pearl Harbor, while not healed, was no longer open and bleeding. The United States was capable of initiative, capable of innovation, capable of daring. And that confidence would matter in the long industrial war ahead. The evolution of warfare. From a military analytical standpoint, the Doolittle Raid represents a textbook example of strategic signaling through limited kinetic action. Its operational objective was narrow: strike selected targets, demonstrate reach, withdraw. Its strategic objective was expansive: alter perception. Modern doctrines often describe this as shaping the battle space, not by destruction but by narrative disruption. The raid forced Japan to divert resources toward homeland defense, extend its perimeter, and pursue decisive engagement prematurely. In doing so, it introduced friction into Japanese strategic planning. Wars are not decided solely by firepower. They are decided by tempo, by decision cycles, by forcing the adversary into reactive posture. For a brief window in 1942, Japan reacted. America dictated. The raiders. In later years, surviving members of the Doolittle Raid gathered annually, raising silver goblets engraved with their names. At each reunion, they toasted fallen comrades and inverted the goblets of those who had passed. It was a ritual of remembrance, not triumphalism. The youngest raiders grew old. The last living participant passed away decades after the war, closing a living chapter of history. Yet their story endured, not because of tonnage dropped, but because of courage demonstrated. Each of those men understood, as they advanced throttles on the Hornet's deck, that survival was uncertain. They flew anyway. 30 seconds. History often compresses complex operations into singular moments. For the Doolittle Raid, that moment was 30 seconds per aircraft. 30 seconds from break release to airborne. 30 seconds in which training, engineering modification, weather calculation, and human nerve converged. If any one aircraft had crashed into the sea, morale might have faltered before the raid even reached Japan. If weather had worsened. If engines had failed. If the picket boat's warning had come sooner. The margin between success and catastrophe was measured not in hours, but in seconds. And yet, every bomber cleared the deck. Sometimes history is not shaped by overwhelming force. Sometimes it is shaped by precision under pressure. The legacy. Today, preserved B-25 Mitchell bombers rest in museums and air shows, their aluminum skins polished, their engines occasionally brought to life for commemorative flights. They are reminders of a moment when aviation theory was defied, when inter-service cooperation overcame doctrinal boundaries, when risk was embraced because strategic necessity demanded it. The raid stands as a case study in asymmetric retaliation, limited force applied for maximum psychological and geopolitical impact. It also stands as a reminder that even symbolic strikes carry real human cost. Legacy therefore must hold both truths. Echoes across time. In contemporary military academies, the Doolittle Raid is examined not simply as a daring exploit, but as an inflection point in strategic psychology. It teaches that perceived invulnerability invites shock. Surprise multiplies effect. Morale can be as decisive as material. Tactical losses can yield strategic gains. Above all, it illustrates that initiative, once seized, can reshape the trajectory of war. The Pacific War would rage for 3 more brutal years, island by island, sea by sea. But April 18, 1942, marked the first moment when momentum subtly shifted. Final reflection. The Doolittle Raid was never about destroying Tokyo. It was about restoring equilibrium. It was about proving that oceans no longer insulated aggression. It was about answering Pearl Harbor, not in equal destruction but in calculated audacity. 16 bombers. 80 men. 30 seconds each. From the rolling deck of the Hornet to the skyline of Tokyo, those seconds reverberated through strategy rooms, through civilian households, through prison cells, and through battlefields yet to be fought. In war, victory is often defined by territory gained. But sometimes victory begins with something far smaller. The moment wheels leave wood. The instant gravity is defied. The breath between doubt and action. 30 seconds that shook Tokyo and changed the Pacific forever.